Hello, everybody. Welcome to this last session of our conference. I'm happy to see that there are quite a few people that survived the whole conference and are here willing to participate and enjoy the last panel, which will be dedicated to behavioral economics and privacy nudging. I'm very happy to welcome excellent speakers to our panel. Which is organized by Alessandro Acquisti. So I would like to briefly welcome and introduce the speakers to you, and then we will go on with their presentations. So the first presenter will be Lori Faith Cranor, who is an associate professor of computer science and of engineering and public policy at the Carnegie Mellon University, where she's a director of the Scilab Usable Privacy and Security Laboratory, commonly known as CUPS. Lori has authored over 100 research papers on online privacy, usable security, phishing, spam, electronic voting, anonymous publishing, and other topics. The second presenter will be Sandra Petronio, who is currently a professor in the IU Department of Communication Studies at the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and in the IU School of Medicine. Sandra is also a senior affiliate faculty in the Charles Warren Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics, IU Health, and an adjunct faculty in the IU School of Nursing and Informatics. Her areas of expertise are in interpersonal health and family communication. The third speaker will be Adam Johnson, who is a professor of behavioral change at the University of the West of England in Bristol. He has a degree and PhD in psychology and has held posts at the Universities of Glamorgan, Open University UK, and University of Bath. He is currently director of the Behavioral Research Lab at the University of the West of England, which is a dedicated research facility focusing on the role of technology in behavior. The discussant of our panel will be Alessandro Acquisti, who is an associate professor of information technology and public policy at the Heinz College, the Carnegie Mellon University, a member of Carnegie Mellon Scilab, and a fellow of the Ponemon Institute. His work investigates the economic and social impact of IT, and in particular the economics and behavioral economics of privacy and information security, as well as privacy in online social networks. So I'm very happy to introduce all the members of this panel. And I would like to welcome the first speaker, Alessandro, who is responsible for this panel, to introduce you to the topic of today's discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleni, and thank you, Lori, Sandra, Adam, and thank you for staying until the sweet end rather than the bitter end. More than a discussant, I guess I'm a pre-discussant. In that I'll try to just spend a few words, a few minutes, positioning the panel and what we are going to talk about, and then I'll shut up and I will let the panelists speak and present their work, and then we will, of course, open to, I hope, many questions from you. It's a great pleasure to have three stellar scholars, leaders in their respective fields. Lori, Sandra, and Adam come to privacy from slightly different directions and different methodologies. But really what brings them together is this desire to understand privacy behavior. I would argue that in the last 10 years, there has been an explosion in empirical privacy research. It's a very exciting period to be in. I'm not claiming by any means that we have answered many of the questions that we ask ourselves, and I'm neither claiming that the panorama is any clearer than 10 years ago, but there is so much research going on. It's very exciting. Now, trying to position very briefly and perhaps a little bit roughly this research, I would argue that we can find the roots of what is happening now, today, in conferences such as this, in at least three different streams of research. The social psychology of privacy, of course, Altman's work that many of you in this room are familiar with. The psychology of self-disclosure, and I'm thinking the Relega, Margulis, and of course, our own Sandra Petronio here. the privacy calculus in privacy economics, so I'm thinking Wolf and Laufer, but also Chicago School scholars such as Stigler and Posner. And of course, in these streams of work, some start in the 70s, some even in the 60s, some in the 70s, some in the 80s, and then more recently, these streams of work were complemented by new approaches, HCI, usability, behavior economics, behavioral decision research. But again, notwithstanding the diversity methodologies in theoretical models and in frameworks, there is this common goal of understanding what are the drivers of privacy behavior, what are the antecedents, what can explain our desire to disclose or to protect, which in the last few years, maybe in the last 2 or 3, maybe at most 4 years, led naturally to a further type of development. The rise of studies which use either nudging, so asymmetric paternalism, or indeed persuasive computing, trying to understand how systems are changed or can be changed or should be changed to affect privacy and disclosure behavior. And this can be done to increase disclosure, think Facebook, changing the interface in order to nudge users to disclose even more personal information, or think researchers trying to create privacy tools which aim at being not substitute but complement to either self-regulatory or regulatory solutions. Now, just to give an example of experiments which show how behavior can be affected, although not nudging experiments, because that's what Laurie will actually cover in a few minutes. I will use 3 quick examples from some studies we have done at CMU. Of these 3, one is old, some of you have seen it, one is semi-recent, and one is very, very recent, very fresh. The old one is about how defaults can dramatically affect how we act in terms of privacy, in fact, our privacy valuations, to the point that the results of this experiment led us to question if you even can talk about a valuation of privacy, and if you can even pinpoint numerically how much people value their privacy. So a few years ago, about 4 years ago, I guess, we went to a shopping mall outside Pittsburgh. We asked people who were in the mall to fill out a survey, and we asked them to participate in a study. And at the end of the survey, I know you've seen it before, down in the back. At the end of the survey, we gave them a card, a gift card, as a thank you. Some subjects got a $10 card, and they were told that their data would be anonymous, and that their identity would not be connected to the transactions done with this Visa debit card. And then a few seconds later, they were told, about 40, 50 seconds later, they were asked whether they, in fact, they wanted to swap their $10 anonymous card with a $12 card, which was instead identified. In other words, now their identity will be linked to the transactions done with the card, but the subject will get $2 more. To another group of subjects, instead, we initially gave them the $12 card, and after about 40, 50 seconds, we asked them whether they wanted to swap it to a $10 card. In other words, whether now they wanted to get $2 less, but have their privacy protected. Now, in fact, all subjects were facing exactly the same 2 decisions. Do I want to be compensated for my experiment with a $10 card with privacy or a $12 card with no privacy? But because we endowed them differently and the default were different, the privacy behavior was significantly different. For the subjects who started with a $10 card, 52% of them kept that card, 48 swapped to a $12 card. So 1 of 2 of the subjects said, no, my privacy is important, I don't want to give away my future transaction data for $2 more. Whereas the subjects who were initially given the $10 card and were asked to protect their data, in that case, 91% wanted to keep the more valuable card, only 9% wanted, in fact, to protect their data. So now we have the same 2 alternatives to propose to subjects, just under a slightly different framing, causing 2 completely different behavior, leading to the question of how can we pinpoint privacy valuations. Another example about the focus that we have currently in the United States on notice and consent approach, transparency and control as ways of solving users' privacy problem. We have to give them more control, we have to give them more transparency. Well, we argue that perhaps control and transparency are good, are important, but they are not sufficient solution for privacy protection. Let me show you why we claim that we made the claim. In the paradox control, we investigated whether control, or even just the feeling of control, can create overconfidence and lead individuals to actually disclose more sensitive information to more strangers. So we asked subjects to fill out a survey, which is, for you, impossible to read right now. The font is very blurry. It was readable by our own subjects. The survey included non-sensitive and sensitive questions, such as non-sensitive, are you married? Yes, no. Sensitive, have you ever used a drug? Yes, no. And we told the subjects that they were not forced to answer any of these questions. It was absolutely voluntary. However, if they did answer, we would publish their answers in the appendix to our research paper. Another group of subjects was given the very same questions, only that we added a little checkbox near the question, asking them to check the box to give us permission to publish the answer. In other words, the end outcome of answering the question would have been the same, but in this condition, we made the subjects feel more empowered, more in control, because they would have to be the ones actually granting us the permission to publish. And in fact, what we were expecting was that simply adding the checkbox would increase the propensity of subjects not just to answer the questions, but in fact to make them publishable. And this is exactly what we found. On the y-axis, we have answer and publication rates across the subjects and across the questions, average. And we are splitting the first condition, blue, and the second condition, more control, red, separating less sensitive questions and more sensitive questions. You have a strong effect, which is stronger the more sensitive the question is, suggesting that the more the subjects felt in control, the more likely they were to allow the publication of the answers, almost by twice as much. Therefore, the paradox, or in fact, illusion of control. And the last study is about the slate of privacy. This is the more recent one. In this slate of privacy, we were investigating the limits of transparency in affecting behavior. Or rephrasing, how you can be completely transparent, give notices to to individuals, which the individuals can parse and understand and act upon, and then you can misdirect the attention with very simple framing so that the transparency becomes ineffective. What do I mean? In one experiment, this was with CMU students, we asked them again a set of questions. Some of the questions were quite sensitive because they related to their potentially sensitive behavior at school, such as cheating classes, being late, plagiarizing material. To one group of subjects, which are here represented with the kind of yellow bar, we told them only a committee of other students will see the answers you're going to provide to this question. To another group of subjects, instead, we told them a committee of students and faculty will read the answers that you give to these questions. And sure enough, we have lower willingness to disclose, as represented in the y-axis, in the group which was told that students and faculty will read the answers rather than students only. This makes sense, right? It's statistically significant. Subjects which were students are less likely to disclose and answer the sensitive questions when they know the faculty will read them. However, here is where the misdirection comes in. We were wondering what happens if you misdirect the attention by simple framing. One example of a misdirection is simply inserting a delay. Because typically, when you read a privacy policy, you don't actually act immediately on it. You read it, and then maybe you go to the site, you spend more time to the site, and then you start revealing or not revealing personal information. A number of seconds or minutes, sometimes hours, pass between reading the policy and acting on it. So how long do you think a delay we need to add in order to nullify the impact of transparency? In other words, to nullify the impact of telling our subjects the faculty will read their answers and make their behavior identical to the subjects who were told that only students will read their answers. It's 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or in fact, 15 seconds. So adding a delay of 15 seconds nullifies the effect of the privacy notice, or even adding a privacy-relevant question, such as another question which misdirects the attention of the subjects between the time they read the policy and they actually start addressing the questions. So these are all just examples of or the kind of studies which try to understand how, sadly, or according to other points of view, luckily, user disclosure and privacy behavior can be affected. The issue then becomes, as a researcher, whether we should affect it, how we should affect it, and in what directions. And I guess both Laura, Sandra, and Adam will have something interesting to say about this. And we start with Laura. Thank you.
I apologize, I'm losing my voice, so you'll have to listen up. I'm going to talk today about some of the work that we're doing at Carnegie Mellon on privacy nudges for social networks. But first I want to put in a quick plug for another relevant conference that some of you might be interested in. We're running the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security in July in Newcastle in the UK. This is the first time that we're holding this conference in Europe, and I hope that some of you will check it out. Okay, so the CMU Privacy Nudges project is a very interdisciplinary project that's looking at how we can anticipate and exploit some of the cognitive and behavioral biases that we've heard about in order to actually help users make better privacy and security decisions. There are a number of other faculty involved, including Alessandro, and we have a whole army of students and postdocs as well. Now, the idea for nudges comes from the concept from economics of soft paternalism. So if you start with the notion of paternalism, that's where we have policies that mandate particular behavior and don't let you make mistakes. We know what's best for you. In soft paternalism, the idea is that we nudge you, but you still have the option of going ahead and making mistakes, or maybe you feel they're not mistakes, that actually is what's better for you. It's also discussed in terms of a choice architecture, that the way we present choices can help nudge people in particular directions. A classic example of this has to do with the display of food. If you display in a cafeteria line all of the sweets and the donuts at the front of the line and make them look very attractive, it's no wonder that everybody eats the sweets. And what they found is that in school cafeterias, if they move the fruit into the front of the line and they put a big spotlight on it and make it more attractive, they can actually get kids to eat more fruit. So can we do this for privacy? Well, maybe we could try making privacy more attractive. And this morning someone said you have to have cute cats, so cute cats and privacy might be the way to go. Or a few years ago, I designed a privacy tool called Privacy Bird. It had a cute bird. Or maybe we could make it cool or sexy. These all might be things that get people more interested in making the privacy choices. We might also do things to help reinforce privacy behavior. So we could have rewards or even just praise. Good job, you didn't share that with the whole world. Or maybe we want punishments or warnings. Another possibility might be to try to make privacy information more salient. So in the Privacy Bird tool that we built, we put this little bird icon in the corner of your browser, and at every website, it would turn colors to tell you whether the privacy policy was good or bad. You didn't have to go read it. It was just always there in the corner, and it chirped really loudly to get your attention. We also built something called Privacy Finder, and this was for search engines. So when you went to the search engine and did your search, to the left of every search result, you would see a privacy meter. And this made it really easy for users to spot the sites with more privacy. And we found in a study that we did, I did this with Alessandro and some students, that people would actually pay more to shop at websites with better privacy policies, but only if we put this information in the search engine where they could easily find it. Here's a screenshot of a Android app that one of my students is working on. And the idea is that when you download Android apps, it's very difficult to understand the privacy information. But what if you put a privacy facts box right there on the download screen? And he's done a study showing that, yes, that actually makes it easier for users, and they're more likely to take privacy into account when downloading apps. Another way of making privacy information more salient is to make the privacy controls themselves more salient. So here we have a picture of my cute kids that I've posted on Facebook, but I don't really want the whole world to see it, only my friends and you guys. And so you can see where I've circled in red, that's the little symbol that Facebook puts so I can see what my privacy settings are. Now, we've actually studied this and found that Facebook symbols are actually not all that easy for people to understand, and they don't help that much. But if you put better symbols there, it actually is helpful. Another project we worked on was a user interface for Tor. One of the problems with Tor is that users are uncertain about whether it's working or not. And so we came up with these symbols to show that, when Tor is working, you should have a bag over your head. If the bag is not over your head, it's not working properly. Don't do anything stupid. We can also show people the consequences of sharing. So imagine if we put under your Facebook post, these people and anyone on the internet in big letters can see your post. That might be useful. We can also do things that make it easier to select the privacy option. Right now in a lot of tools, the settings do not default to privacy. If you just change the defaults, that will help a lot. A lot of people will just accept those privacy-sensitive defaults. If you make the privacy controls and tools more useful, that's another thing that can help. A big complaint about the Facebook privacy settings is they give you a lot of control, but they're actually fairly difficult for a lot of people to figure out how to use them. You can also add friction to the privacy-reducing options. So it's an extra click in order to give up your privacy, or you have to scroll, or you have to wait. So, in this example here, if I try to post a photo publicly, it's going to ask me to confirm. So that's just adding a little extra friction to make sure I really want to do that. So in our nudge project, our approach it was like this. We started out by trying to understand where people needed nudges. Where were people doing things on social networks that they were actually regretting? And we did a series of regret studies. Then we did a bunch of studies, and these are still in progress as well, that are behavioral economic studies, similar to some of the things that Alessandro described. And now we're starting to prototype and test some nudges. We're using Facebook and Twitter as our initial platforms, and we're trying to see whether these nudge ideas can be at all effective. So here's a real-world example of something that when I talk about a Facebook regret. This happened in Pittsburgh, where I'm from. So we had these guys in pierogi costumes who would run around at the baseball game, and they were hired by the baseball team. Our baseball team was very bad, and one of the pierogis posted on his Facebook page just how bad the team was and how mad he was at the management of the team. But it turns out that some of the members of the management were his Facebook friends, and so they fired him. This was actually a front page news story in Pittsburgh, and I got a lot of calls from reporters because by that point the pierogi got smart and stopped talking. But they were interested in this from the privacy angle. They couldn't believe that someone could be fired for posting a remark like this on their Facebook page. The pierogi eventually apologized, and they did eventually give him his job back. But that's an example of Facebook regret. Okay, so we were curious, is it just these examples we read about in the news, or does this happen to normal people? And so we started by doing a series of studies. We did some in-person interviews with Pittsburgh residents. We did some diary studies, again with Pittsburgh residents. And then we did surveys of American users of Facebook and Twitter. Now, our survey data was collected using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, so this is not a representative sample of the US. It's kind of a skewed sample, but it does give you actually a pretty nice nice sample of people who use the internet. We had a bunch of different questions that we investigated. We wanted to know, how frequently do people have these kind of regrets? What do users regret doing? Why do they do this? What are the consequences of these regrettable actions? Are they able to avoid or repair them? And how are regrets on social networks different from regrets in real life? In particular, when we have conversations, we all sometimes put our foot in our mouth and say the wrong thing in a normal face-to-face conversation. So, some overview of our findings. We found, first of all, that regrets are actually pretty common. 57% of the Facebook users that we surveyed had regrets, 51% of Twitter users, and this compared to, we asked the Twitter users also about their conversational regrets, and 79% of them reported conversational regrets. Now, so these numbers are a little bit different, but keep in mind that Twitter users have only been using Twitter for a few years, and they've been having conversations their entire life. We also looked at the kinds of consequences that people had, and we found that there were a combination of very minor consequences and serious consequences like relationship breakup and job loss. But even when people told us, oh, it was really, a minor consequence, nothing really happened, often they were still very upset about it and had a great sense of guilt for having had it happen. We looked at the underlying causes, and some of the biggest ones were people were angry or upset, and so they really wanted to get things off their chest and they weren't thinking. Or for whatever other reason, just not thinking seemed to be a big reason. And then also forgetting who might read their posts, not understanding who the audience is for their posts. We also learned that most regrets occur within 1 day of posting, so it's not something that you realize 2 weeks later for the most part. Okay, so more details. What do people regret on Facebook? And I'll show you a few examples. A lot of posting personal information or issues about themselves or their friends, posts about sex, relationships, posts with a lot of profanity, alcohol and drug use, jokes, lies, and information about their work or company. They also sometimes regret friending or unfriending particular people, tagging people in photos, or using certain Facebook applications. So here's an example. I'll let you read it. And here's another one. Okay, so those are just a few of our collection of about 1,000 different regrets that people reported to us. The big things that emerged, as I said before, were that a lot of these happened when people were in an excited state, either very negative or very positive, more often negative than positive. People not thinking, people who had an unintended audience, people who thought things were cool or funny, people who were under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or people didn't really mean to post it. They actually posted things entirely by accident. So here's an example of that. Yeah, wow. All right, so we dug deeper into the people who said that they had an unintended audience, that their post was read by people who they weren't expecting to. We found that actually about 1/3 of the regrets involved unintended audience. And what's interesting was that 70% of them were people who they actually were friends with on Facebook. So it wasn't enough that they used a friends-only setting. They actually should have been more selective. They didn't actually want all of their friends to see the post. In some cases, the problem was that their friends then showed it to someone else without their permission. This was often, a physically showing the screen, although it could have been an electronic forward. And usually the people that were unintended were in fact their friends or their extended family. The consequences of doing this included feeling guilty, embarrassed, hurt relationships, offending someone, misunderstanding, or getting into some kind of trouble. Now, we repeated this whole study on Twitter, and I'm not going to go into all the details of that, except to say that our findings were very similar on Twitter. And when we did the Twitter study, this time we did a direct comparison with their conversational regrets, because people started asking us, well, that's all fine and dandy, but how is this different than regret in general? What we found is that there were a lot of similarities to conversational regrets, but a few things stood out as being different. One is that Twitter lacks the immediate feedback of a face-to-face conversation. So people said that in a face-to-face conversation, you say something and you can see the looks on people's faces and you stop before you dig a hole too deep for yourself. Whereas on Twitter, you might keep going for a while before you start getting those tweets back that kind of give you that cue that maybe you shouldn't have said that. And so we also find that it takes longer for people to regret things on Twitter than in conversations. And we find that unintended audience is a lot more of a problem, because in conversations you usually know who your audience is because you can see them in the room. So this suggests to us that it might be very useful to have a real-time feedback mechanism, because that would actually address some of these problems that people are having with regrets on Twitter and also on Facebook. So we did an exploratory study to test 3 different nudges that we came up with. We actually have a long laundry list of nudges we'd like to experiment with, but we had to start somewhere, so we built 3 of them. These were implemented as Chrome browser extensions. We did a study with 21 participants for 3 weeks. We collected data about all of their Facebook posts, basically everything they typed on Facebook, we know now. And we looked at that with and without the nudges, and we did an exit survey and follow-up interviews. The 3 nudges that we came up with addressed 3 of the particular things that I pointed out before. We wanted 1 to encourage users to stop and think, 1 to show users feedback on how people might actually perceive the content of their post, and 1 to remind users about who was in their audience. So here's what they looked like. This is the timer nudge. So every time you post, you press the post button and it says you will have 10 seconds to cancel after you post the update. And it counts down. And so you have that opportunity to actually edit your post, cancel the post, or if you don't want to wait 10 seconds, you can press the button to go ahead and post now. Then we had our sentiment nudge, which actually analyzed the words that you typed. So in this case, the user typed, "I am angry," and it says, other people may perceive your post as negative. And so this was kind of a quick and dirty implementation. We didn't do anything really all that fancy in analyzing the sentiment, but we got a basic idea of the sentiment of their post. And then this is our profile picture nudge. What we did was randomly select 5 of the user's friends and show them under their posts so that they get some idea of who would see it. In the case that they were posting something publicly, we actually randomly selected people who were not their friends as well and put those in the mix to really drive home the point that people you don't know are going to see this. So we had about 10 days in what we call our control condition with no nudges, about 10 days in the treatment condition where they had 1 of the nudges. We collected lots of data about what they typed and where they moved their mouse on their Facebook page and their privacy settings changes. Unfortunately, our instrumentation of Facebook was not perfect, and so we lost some of this data. So that's part of why this is an exploratory study, and there's going to be more. We did surveys in the middle of the study and at the end, and then we did a follow-up interview with most but not all of the participants. So here's what we found. The timer nudge participants reported as being overall fairly useful. They said that they actually did catch themselves rephrasing, correcting, or canceling posts when they saw that countdown timer. The profile picture nudge, people also found fairly useful. They said that it helped really make them more aware of their audience. There were people who told us that they had forgotten some of the people they had friended, and this caused them to actually change their privacy settings or sometimes even unfriend people, and also to be careful about what they were posting. The sentiment nudge people really didn't like very much. People said that the positive sentiment, you seem to be happy, was completely useless. That didn't help them in any way. And the negative sentiment just kind of annoyed people. Yeah, I know I'm mad, right? You don't need to tell me this. Also, we found that that our very quick and dirty analysis really wasn't very good, and it sometimes made the wrong decision. So that's something that we're going to revisit. All right, so in conclusion, from our study, we have anecdotal evidence now that nudges actually do impact some of our participants' posting behavior, and I think this is a promising area. We have very limited data because of the small study and some of our technical glitches, and we have some ideas about how to improve the nudges that we actually use. So we're planning on improving the nudges, fixing the technical problems, and doing more studies both on Facebook and on Twitter to see what we can do with nudges. And I'll end there. Thank you.
And I think it will take just a second until we switch laptops. Thank you. Great.
Thank you. It is a delight to be here and to have an opportunity to learn from you the last couple of days. I'm going to talk to you today about a theoretical frame that I've developed for the last 35 years that's evidence-based, and give you some examples of how it's been used. The name of the theory is Communication Privacy Management, and basically, if you want to do a shorthand, it's really informational control and ownership in social networks that I'm going to be talking about today. So people want control over their information. We have these conflicting ideas in the literature about those kinds of issues. We see privacy is fading with Facebook error, but we also see that people are claiming that they really want to have some more control. So the question really is, how can you understand these, what look like paradoxical issues? And of course, I say you should go to communication privacy management. Those people who have studied Altman and have used Altman in today's presentations and other presentations yesterday, you should know that this is the next generation. Altman and I have been very good friends and colleagues for a long time, and I have utilized the core base of his ideas, but developed it into a theoretical frame that is much broader with his endorsement, just in case you think I'm ripping him off, but I'm not. So what has happened with this theory is that I've done pieces of testing. Everything in the theory has been tested over and over again. So it is at this point, with the more than 500 articles that have applied communication privacy management, pretty predictive in terms of how people think about their own private information. I'm going to give you just a couple of bird's eye views of what this theory looks like and some of the basic concepts. It does play on the dialectical notion, because I think Altman was absolutely right, that it isn't paradoxical. In fact, it's dialectical, and that's what causes all the trouble. Because frankly, if there weren't any people around, you'd have as much privacy as you could stand. But the problem is we're both social, and we also want to be autonomous. And so we have these two different kinds of dialectical tensions that we try to regulate. We don't often balance them, but we do regulate them. And the CPM theory argues that we have rules with little r, because they move and change, privacy rules that we regulate those two needs that are in dialectical tensions. The theory also talks about the fact that people believe, and we have lots of data for this, people believe they own their private information. The issue with that that's interesting is that when you give private information to other people, you presume that they're going to be co-owners. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we have control issues. We have a need for levels of control. But in fact, the theory, as I was developing it, it was very clear that unless you incorporated privacy turbulence or breakdowns or disruptions, then in fact you're not going to have a very good theory, because we're working with a dialectical tension that sometimes things just don't work. And you have to accommodate that and show how that gets factored back into adjustments and recalibrations that people use in their privacy rules. So what do we mean by privacy rules? When I first started doing this research, all my colleagues told me I was crazy. I couldn't just ask somebody, what's your privacy rule? And now remember, this is 35 years ago, when privacy wasn't a part of the vernacular in any country. I said, no, I think people have a sense of what they're willing to do and what they're not willing to do. And in fact, that was very true. So we found rules that regulate ownership and co-ownership. Who are you going to tell? Why do you want to tell that person? What are you going to do in terms of then, once you tell, regulating that person's understanding of what you want them to do with your information, because it's always about your information. We have rules that regulate the control. How much information do they get? How much information can they tell? And we also have privacy rule disruptions, as I said, with privacy turbulence. So we have the rules that reveal and conceal, and in a variety of different gradations of those two things. When you look at, and this was another long development of an idea, when you look at what the rules are, how are they created, how are they developed, how are they changed, I came to the conclusion that there really are two criteria upon which those developments happen and those changes happen. We have core criteria where we have personality characteristics. I have a low tolerance for ambiguity, although I'm reformed. And if you're low tolerance for ambiguity, you want lots of information. You seek information and you give information. So that's a personality characteristic that alters some choice making. We've done lots of research on privacy orientations. Families have privacy orientations that they train and socialize their children into. And then as the children grow up and move out of the home, they have to recalibrate that, because sometimes the privacy orientations of their family do not fit the relationships they have with other people, because other people come from different kinds of privacy orientations. Culture is definitely a factor in the kind of rules that people choose and use. And gender is an issue. Males and females have different ways of thinking about what constitutes privacy rules. And that's a critical factor. Now, those stay more or less in the background most of the time. And in uncommon situations, people almost always go to one of these criteria to develop or decide on, because these are decision issues, what rules should prevail. But the fact is that, again, unless you factor in issues of catalyst criteria that will trigger changes in the common habitual rules you might use, you're not going to have a very good theoretical frame to understand how people manage private information. So motivations often change the way in which we think about privacy rules, which also complicates our understanding of what people are doing. And some of the stuff that you've talked about yesterday and today, it comes from the fact that these triggers are there because people aren't sure exactly what to do. They're unfamiliar with the environment. They've never been in this kind of situation on the line. And so they have motivations, though. They want somebody to like them, but they're not sure how the system actually works. And sometimes it's a problem. So they have to change what they did initially when they were making judgments about how much to tell, who to tell, what to tell, and why they want to tell that person. Risk-benefit ratios always come into play because people are calculating good, bad, how for me, not for me, and situational conditions. Being online is a situational condition in terms of what rules you might use. And emotions, as we heard just a few minutes ago from Lori's presentation, emotions are really a factor that often offset the rules that you come into play with, and make it difficult because you have to make up new rules on the spot to be able to navigate wherever you are, especially online. So rule regulations are for two reasons, really. One, for access and coordination. Now, the reason coordination is so important is that if I give you my information, if I tell you make a disclosure and tell you something, I still want to have some control over what happens to that information. So I'm going to try to coordinate the rules with you. And this is in the perfect world, because a lot of times it doesn't happen. But in the perfect world, I try to tell you who else you can tell. That's a linkage in the language of CPM. Who should be linked into your privacy boundary, and what kind of ownership rights are you going to give that other person that's your co-owner? Are you going to allow them to make decisions for third-party disclosures, or do you want them to restrict the information, don't tell Aunt Jean, so you have some way of setting parameters of what they can and can't say, and how much rights they have to make independent decisions, and how much they tell us the permeability. So those three issues, those three coordination rules have been applied in a lot of different places, and they work pretty well to try to get at the fundamentals of what it is people are coordinating with other people when they do it. Oftentimes they don't do it, and then there's lots of discussion and lots of issues and lots of turbulence that comes out of that. Protection restrictions are also navigated and negotiated, but mostly they're identified and used by the original owner. They block the information, there's impermeability, there's no authorization for co-ownership, and all of those things that are protection rules. Sometimes the protection rules allow one other person in, but they become very restricted in terms of what information can flow and where it can flow and who it can flow to. So the issue of ownership, for me anyway, really defines basically the private information system, because if I believe I own the information, I'm going to put the boundary around that information, and I define that information as private. So because it belongs to me, it's private to me, and to some extent, when people do that, there is some potential vulnerability somewhere. You would not recognize what that is. You can't actually tell what private information means to people because it is so variable. We've never been able to hone down exactly a generalizable definition for private information. So what we've been doing in the research is to say, okay, well, it could be anything for anyone. What we're going to try to capitalize on is the behavioral indicator that this information is private. So once we start to see management strategies in place where people are trying to navigate and control and identify what the parameters are for a privacy boundary, then we say, okay, that information is going to be defined as private. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but in fact, when you try to ask people, we've done tons of surveys, all kinds of stuff, what's private information? And even some of my discussions with my colleagues and Altman, it's difficult to pin down. Topic doesn't do it. But you have relationships that get navigated here with the original owner who gives information to a co-owner. And that's a joint relationship. And the original owner often feels that the authorized co-owner has what I call fiduciary responsibilities. That is, you need to, if I'm going to give you this information, you need to take good care of it. I'm entrusting you. And this is true whether you give your information to financial institutions, or you give your information to your partner, or you give information to any category of person. That I believe that you have the responsibilities to do caretaking. And that's one of the things that causes a lot of the problems, because oftentimes we don't negotiate that case, and we don't tell people what the parameters are for what they can and cannot do. And therefore, people utilize information like on the web. You have an online social community boundary around that information. But you can't, because there's so many people that you don't even know, you don't have the opportunity to negotiate what those parameters should be for third-party distribution. We have issues of privacy control and control goals for access and protection. Some people have very high levels of need for control, and so their boundaries are thick, and they don't allow much information out to other people. The most extreme case of this is a secret. Secrets are very low restricted or high restricted information. And then there are moderate levels, and then there are low levels where on the other end of the spectrum where people are very open about the information and feel they probably have fewer privacy rules, whereas the high level control people have a lot of privacy rules. So when we get to turbulence, which happens a lot for people, there is a regulation breakdown. And this is a very simplistic view of all the things we know about privacy turbulence. It's much more complicated. There are more issues than this. But basically, there are minor infractions, so you can repair those quickly and do recalibration of your rules. There are moderate infractions. You tell somebody without permission, which is somewhat problematic, but you can fix that. And then there are significant infractions where it's very difficult. It's going to take a lot of time to do the repair, if ever. One of the things I just want to backtrack for 1 minute, and that is when we think about the privacy issues, person to person or person to individual online, we have to think about the fact that this is housed within relationships. These are really relationships that we're talking about. So I'm going to do a quick overview of some applications because we have so many of them, and I thought I would just pick a few, some of which now very nicely articulate with some of the things that Lori just talked about. So we have several studies about online blogging, and what we were interested in was whether or not people change the rule and what are the conditions for changing privacy rules that they started out with but had to change after they blogged. So these are motivations for rule change that we discovered, and we call them blog scrubbing because people end up trying to take it off, and if it's not in a timely fashion, then what happens is they actually go and do repairs with the individuals. Where there's been conflict, because conflict management is one of the issues that people put something up and go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize my mom was on this blog, now I have to see if I can take it off, or if I haven't done that or can't do that, I have to go talk to my mom. And for protection of personal identity, for fear of rejection, emotional regulation, and purging evidence of a relationship. So when relationships are over, people will want to get rid of any kind of connections to the individual. And those are data. This is open-ended data, and then it's data that was survey data, creating all those different categories. What we talked about, too, is that we found that there's a propensity for blog scrubbing, that there really is. There's a cautious blogger who doesn't scrub because they already vent everything ahead of time. And then there's a high-risk bloggers who don't really care. But everybody in between cares to various degrees and tries to navigate the issues of scrubbing. One of the things that occurred to me would be that group in the middle would be perfect for nudging. Because they're most susceptible. These two end groups aren't susceptible at all because one group already did all the work and the other group doesn't really care. But the group in the middle is perfect for nudging because they would be the most susceptible. We looked at Facebook. This is a study that used CPM. It wasn't one I did. But we looked at parent friending requests, which is a big deal in a variety of different places. And what they found in this study is that, interesting, Facebook friend requests from the parents were not perceived as parental privacy invasion. There's a whole literature on parental privacy invasion. But in fact, in this study, they did not find that to the active friending wasn't associated with parental privacy invasion. These were young adult college students. The parental friend request was associated with a decreased conflict in parent-child relationship, which I find really interesting, and that with more conflicted relationships when they existed prior to the parent joining the child's Facebook, the presence of the parent on the child's Facebook enhanced the child's sense of closeness. So there was a vehicle that actually hadn't been there before, that I don't think that the child probably or the young adult didn't really recognize the impact of that, and it was a positive outcome. So here's another study that Jeff Child and David Westerman did, and the findings here is a friend request from parents. The young adults overall accepted the Facebook requests from parents. But then this is interesting, we have to unpack some of this, but mothers' requests were accepted outright where the family had a more open privacy orientation. So you see the interface of privacy orientations and the interface of rules, because the young adults talked about, well, I'm letting them do it, that's my rule. Mothers' outright acceptance was also influenced by higher quality and more trusting relationships. So those who didn't have a higher quality, less trusting relationship, had less propensity for saying yes. And then families with more protective privacy orientations, low relational, and trust still accepted the parents' request, but that group adjusted their privacy rules and settings way more because they felt that they had to do that. So we have some applications to show how this apparatus of language and concepts can actually initiate research questions as well as help explain the findings once you get them in the context of a theoretical frame that has lots of pieces to it and lots of explanatory power, as I said. So I finished very quickly, right on time, the tour of communication privacy management. There's actually a lot more to the theory to utilize, but these are the basics, and I hope that if you're interested that you'll contact me, and I'd be happy to talk with you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Sandra. I should think about befriending my mom, although I don't know if I fall under young adults category. And I would like to give the floor to Adam for the last presentation of this panel and actually of the whole conference. So, Adam, the floor is yours.
I'm not used to a PowerPoint. There we go. Beginning. Yay. Okay. First, I'm going to apologise that I'm going to slip off early from this panel because I got so confused by the pink website that I booked myself on a train too early. It's difficult to sneak when you're up on stage, but you know, you will notice me sneaking off at some point, so just pretend it doesn't happen. Okay, that aside, I'm going to talk a bit about behaviour change and privacy and talk through some studies that we've done. I've also put in some fluffy animals. I should acknowledge a few people, Mina Vasalu, David Houghton, Ben Marder, Ulf Reitz, and Tom Buchanan, who've all collaborated in some form or other. Probably, you know, they've been the kitten, I've been the rabbit. So the place I think I would like to start is the UK government had a big review of behaviour change and nudging, because the UK government developed something called the Behavioural Insights Group, who have been attempting to apply some of these change methods to paying taxes and so on and so forth. They took lots and lots of evidence, and this is a main conclusion. Our central finding is that non-regulatory measures used in isolation, including nudges, are less likely to be effective. Effective policies often use a range of interventions. And if there's one lesson I would like you to take from this is it, is that actually when we start to talk about nudging and behaviour, what we're really doing is placing the responsibility for protecting privacy or for changing any kind of behaviour on the individual rather than on the organisation that's collecting the data or the regulators or the structure or anything like that. And ideologically, you know, we're buying into a very specific way of trying to think about the role of personal information and people's control over it. So I would just like you to bear that in mind. So if we think about behaviour change, there's a whole series of different interventions we can do. I'm now based in a social marketing group, and one of the ways that people have started to think about behaviour change is whether or not the methods that we're applying are transparent to the recipients of this change or invisible to them. So we can think about transparent attempts, which may be to do with attitude change or fear messages. We could think about much more invisible ones to do with designing the actual choices and the choice architectures that people can are faced with, or using the more kind of fixed action patterns Cialdini talks about, or that we might call nudges in terms of, for example, reciprocity, framing, and so on and so forth. One of the things that seems to come out of the social marketing literature is that the transparent behaviour change efforts are much better for when people actually want to change, when they're open to change. In some cases, this might kind of not necessarily mean that we're best off with a attitudinal intervention. So, for example, obesity. People often want to change but actually find it difficult to. And so some of the more transparent interventions might be more powerful there because it's about changing people's habits. In terms of the invisible options, these are much better when we're actually trying to change people's habits, and they may be resistant to change in some form or other. But the one thing to bear in mind is that there's a whole range of different approaches to changing people's behaviour, some of which will be open to them, some of which will be participatory, and some of which will be invisible to them and will be applied from above. So when we start to think about behaviour change, especially from the perspective of privacy, this also opens up a whole series of questions that we need to address, and some of which have been addressed in this conference and some of which haven't. One is, we've got to be really clear about what the behaviour is that we actually want to change. Are we aiming to change people's disclosure patterns, their interaction? Are we actually aiming to change designers of systems? Are we aiming to change business models? Is the target regulators? We need to be really clear about that. Are we talking about online behaviour or are we talking about offline behaviour? And to really be able to change that, we need to be in a position to understand what motivates that behaviour in the first place, whether it be the business model of the organisation, the security or monitoring requirements of government, or the desire to connect peer-to-peer from other people. And once we're at that point, then we can start to make decisions about, for example, return on investment. Is it worth actually kind of developing all kinds of nudges if we get a very small impact? Or is it worth having a huge educational intervention when we can have the same impact a different way? It's very important to measure interventions, but it's also very important to actually think about how much they cost and what the return on that investment is. We need to think about how long-lasting these interventions are. Alessandro talked about 15 seconds, one question between privacy and action. Absolutely critical. Are we talking about one person's interaction with a website, or are we talking about developing something that goes alongside their entire way of interacting with, say, social media? How resistant is the behaviour that we're trying to change, and what's rewarding it? Ethically, are we comfortable attempting to change people's behaviour without them knowing that we're attempting to change it? Or should we actually want to involve them in the process and adopt a much more participatory approach? And through that, which links to one of the questions raised with the last panel, are we actually really interested in individual change? Is that where we see the locus of control, or are we inevitably going to have to look towards societal change and thinking about the role of individuals in society and where we place that locus of control? One of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that actually attitudes, as most of you will know, don't actually link that well to behaviour. As an example, a while back, we had 759 people who we gave an attitude, privacy attitude concern measure to, and then 6 weeks later, we asked them lots of sensitive questions. And we found a very, very weak link between attitudes and behaviour. We predicted about 5 to 6% of people's willingness to disclose based on their privacy concerns and attitudes. So it's a very weak link between people's stated dispositional concerns and their actual behaviour. So maybe what we don't need to think about is changing people's attitudes, but maybe it's about how they interpret the situation. And we've done lots of research on how we can change people's disclosure patterns. So, for example, a very powerful social norm is mimicry, mirroring, and reciprocity. And some research I published several years ago found that people reciprocate disclosure to websites. If a website discloses information about itself, then they reciprocate that disclosure. Youngmi Moon at Harvard Business School found that people reciprocate disclosure to computers. They treat it as a social interaction. We also found that placing the option, for example here where we have a I prefer not to say option, at the top increased non-disclosure up to at our maximum 36% of people choosing not to say, and if we hid it at the bottom and didn't make it a default, we could get down to 0% of people choosing not to say. Also, if we change people's level of self-awareness by reflecting their photograph back to them, then we can also increase levels of disclosure, and sometimes up to 3 times as much disclosure by having a picture of themselves on screen as they're talking compared to having a video of The Simpsons playing. So we can change people's patterns of behaviour and disclosure online. One of the things that's interesting us at the moment is actually, does this transfer to people's offline behaviour? Because what seems to be happening is that we're all spending time trying to nudge their online behaviour, but people don't seem to be that concerned. And so we're very interested in what happens when people go on Facebook in terms of their levels of self-awareness, and then how that patterns through to their offline behaviour. So one of the first things we did was we got people using Facebook, and we gave them a self-awareness measure. And they either used Facebook and took the self-awareness measure, or they took the self-awareness measure after a filler task and then used Facebook. What we found is that using Facebook changed people's focus on themselves. In the case of private self-awareness, it reduced, so use of Facebook made people less focused on themselves as an individual, which is the group on the left. In the case of public self-awareness, people's concern about the audience, that increased following Facebook use. So people became less focused on themselves and more focused on the audience. What that means is that Facebook should reduce self-disclosure. According to all the theories in social psychology, being less focused on yourself and more focused on an audience should reduce the amount you disclose, should make you more cautious and more concerned. What we suspected was actually what's happening is that people are changing their behavior offline in response to things like social media and Facebook and so on and so forth. And so we designed a study where we primed Facebook and looked at people's willingness to take part in socially acceptable and potentially embarrassing activities. We designed a fake organization called Southwest University Trips. This is Ben Milder, my PhD student. And we recruited them and we told them, this was all males, that the trip was either to a strip club or to a theme park. And to show them, as part of this market research, we showed them either photographs of this visit to a strip club or theme park, either as photographs or as if it were on a Facebook group. And then we asked them how likely they would be to go and also how much they wanted to spend, their spending money. So these are the photographs. You can see one group. You should be able to differentiate between the theme park and the strip club. These are the photographs, and the alternative was that we mocked up a Facebook group where it was a trip to the theme park or a trip to the strip club. So in terms of spending money, what we assumed was that if you were just shown the Facebook pictures, you would immediately be cued to think about the audience, and it would change how much you expected to pay. When you were just shown the photographs, we didn't expect that to be the case. And so people wanted, on average, £12 spending money to go to the strip club when they were shown the photographs. When they were shown the photographs as if it were on a Facebook group, they wanted twice as much, £26 spending money. We created what's called a multiplicative composite, which is by timesing how likely they would be to go with the spending money, and we found a really significant effect, interaction, for the strip club and Facebook Prime compared to the other conditions. So what it looks as if is happening is that as well as Facebook changing the focus people have on themselves, they're less focused, and of course the newsfeed has changed that because it immediately takes you to your audience and your other people. So as well as changing the focus, what we're seeing is it's changing people's decisions about how to behave in offline because of the prospect of things being posted. So perhaps we need to rethink, when we think about privacy, exactly what it means to people. So we've had a lot of discussion about privacy here and a lot of questions about the threat of privacy and how it's being violated and organizations taking privacy and all these kinds of things. So some previous research we've done, we've been looking at privacy as a prototype. So the idea of a prototype is that, as a definition, it comes from Wittgenstein, concepts have fuzzy boundaries. If it's a very clear and not prototypical, then there's very few features and they're all seen as central. So we did a whole series of studies, which I'm not going to go into, which demonstrated that privacy was a prototypical concept. That is, that it was made up of features, some of which were more central to the concept of privacy and some of which were more peripheral to the concept of privacy. And this means is that when we talk about privacy, we're triggering features that could be central or could be peripheral. And you're probably not going to be able to see this, but oh, maybe you can, but the top is gone. On the left is the central features, or some of the central features. These are the things that all our people said were very central to privacy. They were scored, and people misremembered these in all kinds of experiments. So we're fairly confident that these are central. Middle are the moderate, and on the right are the peripheral. Now, one of the interesting things is that the central and moderate features are very much about sharing information. Yes, they're about protecting information and concealing, but there are also things like, which resonates with Sandra's presentation, about setting boundaries, about people you're close with, about small groups, about intimacy, about sharing with a limited audience. These are the things that people actually think about when they talk about privacy. They're about avoiding scrutiny and judgment, about having control. If we look at the peripheral features, subject to invasion, subject to violation, threatened by the internet, fear of adverse outcomes, threatened by the media, threatened by government. The peripheral things that actually people are triggered as actually not that central to their core concept of what privacy is, are many of the things that we keep on talking about in terms of kind of education and campaigning and all the kind of, EPIC and, all very important stuff in terms of dealing with regulators and scaring people about what privacy is. But when we talk to real people, in our sample, the youngest was 16 and the oldest person we asked was 87 in terms of what privacy meant to them. These things are peripheral. Privacy really means sharing, intimacy, closeness in your private life. So external threats to privacy are actually quite peripheral when we think about privacy as a kind of in everyday language. And so we're not really at the position of developing a kind of a new propaganda campaign in order to scare people about the threat of kind of privacy. Instead, what we really need to do is recognize why people share and what the benefits of this sharing are in terms of closeness and intimacy, building relationships. So all the kinds of things that Sandra was talking about in terms of kind of limiting boundaries and managing this. This is the kinds of things that we need to engage people with when we talk about behavior change and when we talk about privacy, why they're sharing in the first place. And as a final note, I think I would say we also need to talk to and we need to work with the organizations that extract value from personal information. The discourse in terms of kind of the taking of information and the consensual exploitation tends to ignore the value that people get from interaction with these services. And also the fact that most of these organizations actually don't want to scare people off in terms of exploitation of personal information. Most organizations actually want to build a relationship with people in terms of kind of long-term use and are crying out for privacy campaigners and for privacy academics to actually engage with them and to find ways that most people can value. Thank you.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you, Laurie, Sandra, Adam. Really nice. I'll kick off the Q&A, and I hope there will be many and interesting questions from the audience. With 3 questions myself, one for each of the panelists. I'll go in the order in which they presented, but I'll posit my 3 questions, and then we start answering at the end. And Adam will have to start because I know you will have to leave soon. Okay. So the first question is for Laurie, and Adam mentioned something in one of his initial slides about nudging, the ethics of nudging. Historically, soft paternalism is effective in fields or areas or scenarios where we can get a reasonable sense of what is the better thing to do, such as smoking on average is not as good as not smoking. Wearing a belt when driving a car is usually better than not wearing a belt. However, in privacy, how do we know whether showing your date of birth publicly is better or worse than not showing it? Uploading the cute picture or the sexy or embarrassing picture is better or worse? For Sandra, I like so much your all the theory, the communication privacy management, but in particular the concept of privacy turbulence. And I wonder whether I can escalate one layer up and ask a kind of a meta question about turbulence in privacy research. What I mean is, at the start of the panel, I was presenting the optimistic side of the current state of behavioral work in privacy. It's exciting, there is an explosion of research, so many methodologies, so many researchers. That's my optimistic side. The pessimistic side is that there are so many researchers, so many studies, so many methodologies, and we are not really talking much to each other. We use different languages, sometimes we even come with different conclusions. And this is a problem. And I wonder whether you have some thought about this, because you have started crossing different type of conferences, as you've seen, different approaches to privacy behavior. And the last question for Adam, kind of a question/comment. So I'll push back if you allow me, on the connotation of nudging as a form of responsibilization. In that, and we're referring, of course, to a concept that Seda was referring to already earlier today, responsibilization, a terrible word for a terrible thing, a situation where you create a problem and then you push the responsibility to solve the problem onto the users. And in my view, reliance or self-regulatory policy solutions, which is typical of the United States, free market solutions to privacy problems, such as notice and consent, transparency and control, those are the strong examples of responsibilization, such as we give users more information, we give them more control, and that now is their problem, and they have to solve their privacy boundaries and do privacy management. On the opposite side, you have regulation. You cannot do such and such with your data. In between, you would have soft paternalism or nudges. So the attempt of recognizing that choice architecture is never neutral. There is no neutral default setting. The moment Facebook creates an interface is affecting how much people will disclose. So nudging is a way to try to regain some power by making the designer more aware, if they're not already and using it intentionally, more aware of the power that their design choices have on users' behavior. It may be by changing the choice architecture, you can actually empower users or make it less difficult for them. So, do you want we start with Adam, and then Sandra and Laurie? And then I hope that in the meanwhile, you guys will think of many other questions.
Thanks, Alessandro. I wasn't expecting that. So you're asking about responsibility and regulation. I think, I mean, I tend to agree with you, but what I think is really important is to recognize that good kind of behavioral change doesn't just rely on individuals taking responsibility, but also that in an ideal world, it leads them to become advocates for change in some way or other. So we may want individuals to take responsibility for, the use of renewable energy, or for driving, or recycling. But actually, what we also want is for them to become advocates for climate change. And we're never going to solve the kind of problems of the world by everyone recycling everything. But what we might do is when they take small actions and actually kind of link it to wider problems, then they become advocates rather than individuals who we're nudging or changing. And I think that's got to be the critical point, is that if we just rely on changing people's behavior with a complete lack of kind of transparency, then how are they going to become advocates? Because we've designed a choice architecture that pushes them in a direction without them realizing it. What we need is a way that we can actually guide them to not only make, or be in a position to make informed choices, but also that they can advocate for it. Yes?
You're asking about the meta issues of privacy turbulence. Is that true? Mm-hmm. Okay.
You're also free to continue, however, on what Adam was saying.
Well, in some ways, there's some connections to issues of responsibility, because I think the concept of turbulence has gradations to full breakdowns. And so I think when we look at the landscape of all the things that are happening with privacy, the only way we really understand whether some of the rules are actually expected by an original owner is when things don't work. And so it's a self-regulating system. It's actually a very important concept, because it allows you to recognize yourself that you had rules that you didn't really know, which I think happens a lot to people, where you have some guidelines in your head and you presume everybody's going to do that, and then they don't. But then you realize, I actually care about this, and I understand that I care about these particular rules that I want people to follow, or expectations that they have. I have an example that has absolutely nothing to do with privacy, but it gets at the missed expectations. I had a student who had been, this woman was recently married, and they made plans for the holidays. She and her new husband talked about going to parents for Christmas and and each of them booked separately to their own parents for Christmas vacation. And so they had the same language. Let's go to the parents for Christmas. But the enactment of those expectations were completely different, because they had tickets, one to Florida and one to California, for that same Christmas. And so I think we aren't mindful of the way in which we have expectations for behavior that other people should enact, especially when it has to do with stuff that's important to us. Because that's why turbulence has to be a part of any discussion of privacy, because we don't often make obvious to other people, or do we have a good sense of where our limits are, where the boundary limits. And it's only through the turbulence that you begin to create a profile for yourself, an understanding for yourself of where those limits are, and then how to communicate that to other people.
Thank you. Laurie, on the ethics of nudging?
Sure. So you asked about how we know what is actually good for people, and who are we to decide that it's better to share or not to share. And it's a really good question, and something that as we've been working on the Nudge project, we've been trying to grapple with. And part of doing the whole regret study was to inform ourselves of what people felt were the sort of things that they did end up regretting. But even so, in any given instance, we can't predict for a particular person. Just because some informant told us that they regretted doing that doesn't mean that any particular person would also regret doing that. Maybe for them it would be a positive thing. So in thinking about the types of nudges that we could do, and I showed you, a bunch of examples, some of them serious and some silly, we ended up shying away from the nudges that were very judgmental. We didn't do the nudge that said, "Good job, you didn't share this." We didn't do that one. Instead, we ended up implementing nudges that were more informative. And so the judgment that we made, because as Alessandro said, that there's always a judgment. You can't avoid that. The judgment we made is that informed sharing is better than uninformed sharing. And so we want you, if you're going to share, we want you at least to be informed about what you're doing. And so we focused on nudges that would increase the information, and then and hope that would allow people to better reflect and judge for themselves whether this was going to be a good thing or a bad thing to share.
Please.
I love the nudging study and issues of regret. But one of the things that occurred to me is that a lot of the examples that you gave has to do with regret that then was really the outcome was personal embarrassment. And so the idea of personal embarrassment means, though, that you need to do some kind of repair. That's a follow-up to that, whether however you choose to do that. But if you can't repair, I did a study a really long time ago. It was called Relational Baggage. You carry the baggage with you if you can't repair that kind of stuff. We used the title from some student who told us about his regretful in a relationship, and it was called The Psycho Bitch from Hell. So that's really regret. You don't want to get in another relationship with someone who we tried to find the male counterpart, but we couldn't come up with that. I don't know why. So I think that whether or not that's true for the entire data set, I don't know, but it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly some people who had other consequences besides embarrassment. There were some where they did harm relationships, or they lost jobs, or got in trouble at school, or things like that. And then as far as the ability to repair, we did ask them about that. And some people said they were able to repair, and other people felt that they hadn't actually satisfactorily repaired the situation.
Questions from the audience? If you guys are still there, because it's so black from here. It's very dark.
We actually can't see you.
I see
very
two
well.
hands.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah, and preferably first questions for Adam, who has to go.
Yeah.
Because Adam will leave.
My question is for Adam, actually.
Brilliant.
I'm Christina for the University of Leeds. For me, the interrelationship between privacy and intimacy is very close, but in your study, you said that it was a moderate feature of what privacy is, and I was wondering what is your concept of privacy related to intimacy? Thank you.
So, yeah, so it did come out as kind of most of the intimacy features came out as moderate. I think that's just because when people are actually thinking about it, what triggers it is very much kind of things about kind of private and public, at least initially. And then when you probe them more, that's when they start to get into the intimacy stuff. But of course, I mean, you need privacy for intimacy, as far as I can see. I mean, if you're open to every single person in the world, then how do you demonstrate that you're close to someone?
Hi, a question for Adam too. So I found very interesting the perspective on privacy as intimacy and sharing. It's not usually the perspective we have, but I think is one that makes perfect sense. But what I was a bit more confused about was when you brought in your last slide the role of companies that deal with personal information, in the sense that intimacy, to me, in a way, suggests that the environment in which I am sharing the information contains only people that I deeply trust. So I am not sure how to interpret what you said, or if we should have like some kind of bonding and intimacy with big organizations, or in which way you were somehow bringing that in.
Okay.
You're going to miss the train, Adam.
I know. I'll be really quick, and then Sandra's going to be me from then onwards, I think. I think there's two aspects, but I think the key is when social media is used in order to enable intimacy. I think that's the really core bit, and where we really need to engage with and talk to organisations. I know there's been a lot of talk of Facebook, but of course there's lots of other ways that people are using social media in order to connect and build relationships. And one of the kind of concerns is that what they're doing is they're creating environments that allow people to build relationships and to build intimacy, or as Laurie showed, to kind of make regretful comments that may harm that. And I think that role is really, really important, because the way that we behave, the way that we enact intimacy, and the way that we share and the way that we connect is very much based on the environment. Just as we signify closeness or intimacy, or the revealing of a secret by leaning into someone, or by closing a door, or by looking over someone's shoulder, so the same sites and organisations often are providing an environment for us to behave in, need to kind of take a responsibility for understanding some of the design implications for what they're doing. I'm going to hand over to you. You're going to ask again, but then I'm going to run.
The comment is very quick. So in a way, I have the impression that it's a fake sense of intimacy, or it can be seen as a fake sense of intimacy, in the sense that it's creating intimacy in a room with hidden microphones and cameras to some extent. So that is a bit my concern, that the perception is one thing and what is going on in the system might be another.
I'm going to let
You're going to be
yeah, well, I don't know about that. Maybe a different framing might give some insights to some of these issues that you've raised. We have both intimate relationships, but we also have functional relationships. And if my functional relationship is me and my bank, and I have trust within limits, and I understand the parameters of those. I would never want to have an intimate relationship with my bank or banker. So I actually don't see that when you have lots of privacy, you have intimacy. That doesn't always happen, and that shouldn't happen, because we have all of these different kinds of relationships that require us to manage private information in a variety of different ways. So intimacy is restricted to, strong time relationships, relationships that are long-term, however you want to define intimacy. So I don't know if that gets at some of your issues, but I think that we need to understand that because we're always looking at relationships within the context of privacy, or privacy within the context of relationships, we have to understand better what that means. We have weak ties, strong ties, we have all these kinds of issues that are prevailing in relationships.
Yeah, I just want to add to that in the privacy theory literature, there's all sorts of different types of privacy, and I guess Alan Weston distinguishes intimacy from confidentiality, from there's solitude. There are a bunch of different ones that he talks about, and I think that a bank relationship maybe is more of a confidentiality relationship than an intimacy relationship.
Ashkan down in the back.
So this is kind of a comment and a question for Lori and Alessandro, which is, as we do the kind of privacy nudging, or in the development of these privacy-enhancing tools, as we have informational or informative type of representations like the bag over your head and such, I just want to kind of observe that oftentimes we want to be careful that we're not also over-promising, right? So in Tor, for example, there's been great studies to show that when people use Tor, they're actually more risky in behavior. And so, Moxie did a study in, I think, 2009 at Black Hat, able to strip a lot of information from people using Tor. And so the idea of having a paper bag on your head might imply that you're kind of fully anonymous and you can then engage in really risky behavior like posting your name or posting inflammatory comments. And what I worry about is that you kind of, by nudging in a particular direction with people that don't understand the implications, you might actually get either overconfidence, right? So you have this idea where you have overexuberance and people become overconfident in their decision making, and then ultimately lead to a backlash if they're ever to be burned, right? So we know, for example, private browsing mode. A lot of my research has showed private browsing mode is actually not private. There's quite a bit of tracking. So most people are like, screw it, I won't even bother because they're always going to track me. So I'd love to hear your comments.
I think that's a good point. I think one of the things that we talked about in our nudges is whether we should always show a nudge or only show the nudge when the software has run an algorithm on it and determined that what you're posting is risky. And for the moment, we're always showing a nudge, in part because we don't have the algorithm to decide that it's risky, but also in part because of the concern that people might be overconfident. Oh, no nudge appeared. It must mean that it's fine. And so I think that is something to think about in the design decision. In the Tor user interface, I think whether or not Tor is a safe thing to use in the first place is a good question, and a lot of questions have been raised about it. We wanted to address the problem, though, of people who said, I can't tell if it's on or off, and I need to know that. We talked about a lot of different metaphors. We liked the bag because our judgment was that, hey, somebody wearing a bag is not completely anonymous. Like, at any time, someone could, tear your bag off or see the rest of your body or whatever. So it shows some degree of anonymity without being perfect anonymity. But that said, we never got as far as user testing that and seeing whether our idea of what it conveyed actually matched what real people would do. And if we were going to go further with it, that would certainly be something we'd want to check to see if people were getting the wrong impression from that sort of an icon.
And to follow up on this, Ashkan, the problems you mentioned are real, and the results of the TOR study are consistent with, for instance, our own results on the paradox of control. You give tools for control over personal information, you create overconfidence, and users end up taking more risks in the sense of revealing more sensitive information to more strangers. That said, and this is my disagreement with a view Adam mentioned earlier, at least in theory, the way nudges should work, if you go back to Thaler and Sunstein, who are justifiably considered the fathers of this type of research, it's not as much as about affecting behavior, or in fact, it's absolutely not about decreasing choice. The element of choice remains, the freedom of choice remains, but it's about taking into consideration the impact that certain known behavior and cognitive biases will have on behavior, such as our love for status quo, the power of default settings, the impact of hyperbolic discounting and immediate gratification. So you take that into consideration in the design of certain choices. Now, not always, if you take one bias into consideration, you eliminate the others, which is why I never seen, and I have to admit that I'm switching my hat here from discussant to kind of panelist, because I do work with Laurie on privacy nudges. Nudging should never be seen in isolation from a mix of interventions which try to help behavior.
Well, I think that at least from my perspective, that the nudges, what they do is if people believe they own their information and they believe that they have the right to control the information, this gives a ready source to do that. They can just make the judgments themselves. And even if it isn't 100% issues of control, you're giving me something to use that I can make a discernment with and see, okay, let's try this, see how that works. Looks good to me. But if I don't know anything, I either click, I'm not going to, let that arrive in my on my computer, or I'm not going to have that website or go to that website or do this, whatever, because I have no clue. So I miss out on things, or I don't miss out on things and get things, and then I'm sorry about that. But this allows that kind of regulation that people really want the opportunity to have.
We have a question near the last row.
Yeah. I just had one quick question as regards the entire notion of nudging and behavior modification. I thought it was sort of interesting that Adam brought up. So it seems to me like, a lot of the work presented is how to make users aware via privacy nudges of the fact that their behavior is possibly against privacy respecting values that we believe they have. At the same point, the real goal of personal data collection via these social networks and then the behavioral advertising industry really is behavior modification. The goal of these industries actually is behavior modification. Has there been any studies that sort of compare, I'm sure there are, but I'm just not aware of them, people's consumer habits before they were exposed, if we can find such people, to behavior modification via advertising, and studies which have experienced behavior after? Because it seems like that is almost, to be honest, just as interesting and just as important as privacy nudging.
So I don't know of any specific studies that have been published along those lines. You can be sure that Facebook is doing those studies internally, and that the changes that we see over time to their user interface are the result of those studies. So, it used to be that there was a box for you to comment on posts, and it was just an empty box. And now it's a box with your picture next to it. And I would guess that it turns out when you put a picture next to the box, people are more likely to type things into it. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing they tested that and they found that people were more likely to type when they would see that. So I suspect that they know.
So to follow up on this, I'm not sure whether your question was only focusing on just-in-time behavioral change, how behavior is affected by behavior advertising, or longer-term changes, how our attitudes overall change after we are engaged in a system which do that. For the second question, I don't know of specific studies. For the first question, there is a study, at least one I know about, by Tucker and Goldfarb on the impact of behavioral advertising compared to non-behavior advertising on consumer behavior. It came out a couple of years ago in Marketing Science, I believe.
Just as an add-on remark to that, we can of course assume that advertisers are stupid and superstitious, but I don't believe that. I mean, if we think of how advertising works, let's say on television, it is behavioral or targeted advertising. I mean, they do very, very close analysis of who watches these shows, and the prices are higher when it fits. So it's very obvious that behavioral advertising works. And we don't even need to go to the internet for that.
So I wasn't arguing that behavioral modification doesn't work. It obviously does. I'm just saying as a framing of the question, what we're sort of assuming is that there's basically privacy-based values that we're trying to return people to. And what's actually happening, which I think is actually possibly more disturbing than the loss of control of data, is actual very personalized mass behavior modification, which is possibly very, very effective. And the fact that there hasn't been independent analysis of that and its long-term effects is something maybe the academic community could address.
What kind of behavior are you talking about there? I mean,
shopping values, mostly I would assume you would look at shopping, but you can also look at the effect of behavioral modification surveillance on, say, content, who's posting what kind of content, and even political situations.
Well, there have been interesting studies, and Adam was pointing at them about reciprocity in disclosure. When people disclose to you, you feel more compelled to disclose to them. We also did some studies about herding behavior, imitative behavior in terms of when you see lots of people disclosing personal information, even if not to you personally, you just observe high disclosure, then you become more likely to also disclose sensitive information. When you combine those together, you start seeing why, and I'm not implying that the Facebook designers were doing this intentionally or not, I cannot make any such claim, but you can understand the power of Facebook wall in that it creates this appearance of a continuous disclosure by all your friends. In fact, maybe each of your friends is only posting something once every 3 days, but because you have 500 friends, you have this appearance of a continuous stream of disclosure by everyone, which in turn creates more disclosure by you, which in turn influences other people's disclosure. So how intentional this is, I cannot tell, but in terms of objectively claiming that it is a powerful effect, I would say that we have grounds to say so.
I think there have been some studies of the effect of friends posting about voting on the likelihood that you'll go vote with the American elections. I can't remember who did that, but there was something along those lines as well.
Well, since the most effective behavioral modification is intermittent, it would have to be a longitudinal study, really, for it to fit the expectations for actual change that would be stickable for any period of time. But I think in terms of the kinds of stuff we've talked about here today, the blog scrubbing, we saw repeated change of rules. It wasn't a controlled experiment, but what we saw and we interviewed the respondents afterward, and they told us about the fact that they'd have to remember next time, and whether they do or not, is an empirical question. But there's clear indications that those things occur, and so I think that they're credible, and we need to take them into account. And if you want to do a long-term which would be good, behavior modification study, then I think that would help for the particular group that you're looking at.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. Yes. Microphone coming.
On so I can see who I'm talking to. Hello, folks.
Hi.
It was really interesting to have a very North American-oriented panel and to hear about research that was not just 1 or 2 years old, but actually really grounded and dated over 3 decades. I think my question will largely go to Sandra, but more than happy that Alessandro or that Laurie comment. Thank you so much. I'm thinking back to what you call privacy rules criteria, if I recall rightly, which were, from memory, rather individual and psychological, and also included gender. But coming to this from perhaps a more European view, I was wondering to what extent you actually view legal and regulatory views of privacy, which certainly around the European Union, despite the fact that we have single directives or we have attempts coming up at single regulations, do in fact differ between nations. I mean, I'm thinking there particularly of, say, the German take on what types of racial data or not ought to be circulated, or another example might be the way in which Scandinavians happily share salary data quite openly, whereas in an Anglo-Saxon British environment that is really quite a psychosis that we wouldn't possibly share that kind of data with colleagues or with friends, or not even with spouses, let's say. So I just wondered, coming where you're coming from in the US, with a nice European mix there. I know Alessandro originated from somewhere else. How much is this focus that we have on the individual and his or her individual attributes, how does that counterbalance against our cultural, historical, legal, regulatory views of privacy? Thank you.
I think that the reason that culture was in there to be a core criteria was for that very reason, because there are studies using this theory in Egypt and in China and in the European countries, so that we can see the things that are consistent across culture, and we can see things that are idiosyncratic to a particular culture in terms of what constitutes a privacy rule, how much culture plays in the decision criteria choice for rule usage, and it's a template from which we utilize to make research questions and develop measures, and because it has some fluidity, but it has some core values, it allows for that flexibility of lots of different ways in which we can understand how these issues play out. I mean, I think in the development of the theory, that's what I was trying to do, is go up here, not so far up that it was completely abstract and we couldn't understand it, but enough so that what I wanted to find were the consistencies of how people manage private information, and what seemed to prevail, over and over and over again, all the different kinds of ways we looked at it. And culture clearly is there and plays and influences rule choices, and influences the way in which people negotiate or navigate. Because in China, when you look at the health care issues, in China, the families don't tell the mother or father, whoever the patient is, they don't tell the patient that they're ill. They don't tell them that they have cancer. They know they don't feel well. They may be in the hospital, but they never reveal the fact that what the diagnosis is. And it's a family decision. It isn't an individual patient decision because it's more of a collective issue. And that's very different than in the U.S. In the U.S., it's mandated that you tell the patient first and only unless the patient gives permission for other people to know what the diagnosis and the prognosis is for any particular illness. And we see that in studies and stuff that look at that, but what we have is an apparatus to be able to do that.
Laurie? Then my only comment about your question is, one of the biggest differences I see in the policy approach in the US and the EU is in the US there is this strong reliance on control and transparency in isolation from the rest of the OECD FIP, Fair Information Principles. It is as if we forgot that other principles existed such as purpose, limitation, and accountability. And we started believing that only two of them in isolation from the others can work. And maybe they cannot.
Thank you for the question.
At this point, I would like to thank, first of all, Alessandro for putting this panel together. Then I would like to thank Laurie, Sandra, and Adam for excellent presentations and a very interesting panel discussion. And I would like to give the floor to Seda for the official closing of the conference.
Thank you, Eleni.
I thank you for an excellent final panel. On a Friday evening, I have to admit, nobody has left during the panel except one of your speakers. So I would like to take a few more minutes of your time to go through a good list of people who have made the last 2 days possible. I'm going to start with the egg. I want to include especially our sound person who has been with us all day long, all the catering people, and also people in the back office who have actually moved us here downstairs and kept us warm and our conference going. I'd like to thank Hector, who is now focusing his camera, who joined us from the UK. He's part of the collective People Speak. And when do you think we'll have the videos, Hector? In about a week, he says. We'll give him 10 days, no? Okay. Okay. We definitely would like to thank all of the tete-a-tete presenters and thank all of you who visited them and found out about their projects. They have come from far and close, and we thank them very much for the intimate sharing of their projects. We definitely like to thank all of our speakers for also coming from far and close and really bringing a lot of insights and showing the complexity of the concept of privacy and how it works in interaction with online social networks. The rest of the list is a little bit more intimate on the organizational and back-end side, so I would like to make some people visible. Some of them were, so the captains of the panels, they are the ones who put the programs together and put the concepts together for the panels. These are Claudia Diaz, Ralf de Wolf, Jo Pearson, Eva Levens, Rob Heyman, Ike Picconi, Matthias Vermeulen, and Alessandra Christie. A round of applause. The pinkifiedness of the whole conference with the For Your Eyes Only website belongs to Pierre Marchand and Eric Scriver of the open source publishing. They only use open and free software, and all of our design elements are online. If you want to pinkify your conference, please feel free to look at their GitHub. I would also like to thank Eero Balsa, who made the booklets using the open source design elements, and Annette Dems, who made the web page. And I would at this point also like to invite Annette, Eveline, Hans, who's not with us, but in place, Jo Pearson, and Pauline Coppens to the stage. We've been working together for about a year making this conference possible. They have done a lot of work getting the whole conference venue together. They have been somewhat invisible in the background, answering your questions and filling in all the holes and making sure that everything goes smoothly. If you could please come forward. And of course, we need to say a nice word to our sponsors, the wonderful reception last night of LSEC, the conference speakers dinner from Microsoft, and iMinds, who printed our booklets and supported our conference the whole time. And of course, a big thank you goes to IWT, who funded the 2 projects, which have been somewhat intermingled with our invited speakers and the panels who presented their results, MSOC and SPION, and I thank Jo Pearson for leading the MSOC project, and Bart Purnell and Claudia Diaz for the SPION. Thank you. Oh yeah, and thanks for coming too.
But of course, we would like to thank Seda,
Yes.
who has been behind everything.
I hope you have a wonderful evening in Brussels if you're still here. And let us know if you need tips and all that.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Sandra.
Oh, thank you.